Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, Episode 4. I am the show's host, Kyle. And before we jump in today, I just have a few quick notes and things to talk to you all about the show. First off, I'm looking for any guest suggestions. Maybe I'll have somebody on, do a little interview. The person I would be looking for is somebody who knows anything about foreign policy, journalists, any other foreign policy podcasters out there who maybe have some interesting ideas or views on foreign policy. Be willing to talk to them. Any questions that anybody has, feel free to either email them to me at kylesfilesblog@gmail.com or leave a comment, message me on Facebook, facebook.com/kylesfiles. Also, I got a couple good reviews on iTunes, so thank you very much to the people who gave me those reviews. And if you're listening to the show and you like the show, really help me out if you go ahead and just leave a short little review and rating on iTunes. I'd really appreciate it. It would really help the show maybe reach some new listeners if people are looking for a podcast to listen to on foreign policy and they see one that has some awesome ratings and reviews. It might, help them to give me a listen. And this is the second week of Foreign Policy Focus. Week 1 went really well. I'm really encouraged by everything. So I think I'm going to keep moving forward with this. I really like it. And like I said, if you like it, give me a good rating and review. Alright, moving into foreign policy news. We'll start with Israel. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced that they are pulling back a little bit on some settlement expansion. This announcement came after Benjamin Netanyahu met with Trump and talked with Trump last week. Trump has been pretty clear that he believes the settlement expansions are a threat and do not help peace. So, I think we are seeing one good thing about President Trump so far, and that is that he's had a little bit more of a reasonable approach on the Israel situation. I certainly wouldn't call it a good approach. I don't think he's going far enough. I think Trump should, kind of give Benjamin Netanyahu an ultimatum. Tell him that if he doesn't stop the settlement expansion, then he will lose all the foreign aid from the United States, which is billions of dollars every year, and certainly would be something to leverage. President Trump should also let Benjamin Netanyahu know that if he doesn't pull the Israeli Defense Forces out of the West Bank and Gaza, that Trump will pull all military support that the U.S. has from Israel. With as much aid and support that the U.S. gives Israel, we have a lot of leverage here to work in, rather than letting the Israelis continue to oppress and really have a near apartheid state in Israel, force them to adopt more reasonable and humanitarian positions, or we will pull all of our support. Not only should we do this for a moral reason, but there's a good reason for Americans to support this position, and that is with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and the U.S.'s support for Israel, it gives the Arab world a very negative view of Americans. We're seen as the group that could come in, provide so much support to a country that does so much damage to its really citizens and the Palestinians, and that this won't be able to happen without the United States, so it really paints the United States as an enemy. So like I said, I think the best position for the U.S. to take is to leverage all of its support that it gives Israel against the Israelis adopting a more humanitarian policy towards the Palestinians. And if Israel doesn't do that, I think we should pull those supports. I'm not a fan of foreign aid in general, and I don't think we should be giving it out. A country $20 trillion in debt probably shouldn't be giving away $3.8 billion a year to the Israelis. But so long as we're going to be giving them the support anyways, let's attach strings to it to make sure that that money isn't going to be used to abusing a group of people who really have no defense for themselves at this time. Moving on to Afghanistan, we have a situation where the Afghani government announced that they were going to try to stomp out ISIS in the Nangarhar province, and a couple days after that announcement was made, ISIS actually launched an offensive against the Afghani military forces there. They were able to overrun a couple security posts and kill 17 members of the Afghani armed forces. So this situation is turning into a failure much sooner than even I expected. I didn't think that this was going to work out very well for the Afghani armed forces. I thought that they would maybe go lose some troops fighting ISIS, but be able to make some successful gains against ISIS, at least in the interim, before the Afghani military eventually left the Nangarhar province and then ISIS returned. However, it looks like this time ISIS is just going to put up a fight and say we're not going to go and attack the Afghani military straight from the beginning. One concern I have is that if ISIS does start winning battles in the Nangarhar province and it really starts to paint a weak and bad image of the Afghani military, since that military is supported by the U.S. and may cause the U.S. to be put in a position where they have to ramp up military support for the Afghanis. One common thread about Trump is that he doesn't like to be seen as a loser or supporting a loser, so I think we really could see these negative effects coming, that Trump would probably, rather than saying, okay, this mission in Afghanistan is a complete and utter failure, and pull U.S. troops out and just let the Afghanis, try to settle things out for themselves, that he would be more likely to ramp up support and just maybe go with another surge or something along those lines. In fact, I think we could see this happening because one of the people that Trump is interviewing to replace Flynn as National Security Director, our National Security Advisor, is David Petraeus. And David Petraeus is a general that ran the surges under, I believe, Bush and Obama. Bush in Iraq, Obama in Afghanistan. And both of those surges were utter failures, but the media narrative and the narrative around the U.S. is that those surges were to accomplish a mission. Once again, I'm not sure what mission that is, because in Iraq, we have a situation where ISIS controls Mosul. So if that mission was successful, you would think the Iraqi state would control at least most of their own country. In Afghanistan, same situation where the Taliban control nearly half of the country now. Those surges have to be seen as a failure. Back to Afghanistan, with the situation where the Afghani military is losing ground to the ISIS fighters in this province, I think we could see an increase of U.S. military support for the Afghanis. Moving around the Middle East, now we're going to get to Syria. In Syria, there's a couple new news stories. The first is that Turkey says they control most of al-Bab, although human rights groups suggest that this isn't true, and it's likely that Turkey only controls roughly 10% of the city, with ISIS controlling the other 90%. As of Saturday and the 48 hours leading up to Saturday, the Turkish warplanes and military had killed about 45 civilians in al-Bab. This brings the death count in the whole operation, the whole Turkish operation to retake the city, to 430 civilians. So Turkey is a NATO ally, and the U.S. had offered Turkey some support under Obama to help with the invasion of al-Bab, and Turkey had turned it down. They had worked more with the Russians at least a few times in this operation to retake al-Bab, but it seems that Turkey is mostly going this operation alone, and it is not going well. I think Turkey kind of had the idea that it would be a cakewalk going in and kind of taking over this area from ISIS. However, ISIS has put up a really big fight and prevented Turkey from quickly making progress in the city. Once again, Turkey's next steps after taking al-Bab will be to move on to Raqqa, where it's setting up a huge showdown between ISIS's enemies, the Kurds and the Turks. And so it's going to be a real mess around Raqqa, where you're going to have Turkey, who hates ISIS and the Kurds who hate Turkey and ISIS who hates both groups as well. It's really going to be an interesting situation to see what the U.S. is going to do, because the U.S. has armed and supported the Kurds. And at least under Obama and in the beginning of Trump's tenure as president, the idea was that the U.S. would use the Kurdish forces to retake ISIS, or to retake Raqqa from ISIS. And now that the U.S.'s NATO allies and Turkey are moving in and have plans to retake Raqqa from ISIS, but to stop the Kurdish forces from doing it as well, it's going to set up a very interesting and difficult decision for Trump and the U.S. military to make, whether to support its NATO allies or its de facto Kurdish allies. In other Syrian news, Doctors Without Borders released a report that the Russians were responsible for bombing a Doctors Without Borders hospital last February. The hospital was bombed, and 20 some odd patients or civilians were killed in the bombing. It was unknown exactly who committed the bombing. It was speculated that it was possibly the U.S. because it was an area in Syria where both the U.S. and Russian and Syrian warplanes were flying at the time. This story is important because while, I think everybody focuses on the 25 people that were killed in the bombing, but with the situation in Syria with so many civilians being killed and all the militaries in the area really not caring about civilian life and inflicting as much damage on civilians as they do, this hospital probably has let hundreds die since it's been destroyed or out of service. And so whenever governments bomb hospitals, what's seen and what's known is how many people are killed at the time and, the tragedy of people bombing a hospital. But what's missed is all the people that die because there's no access to medical care moving forward. I think this has been something that's been missed in Yemen and Afghanistan as well. We had in, I believe, October of 2015, a U.S. warplane bomb a hospital in Kunduz, and it was really the only medical center in the area, and it was a Doctors Without Borders hospital. It was a real tragedy. And after that, the hospital didn't reopen right away. And so a lot of people were unable to get the medical care they needed and certainly died. And while those who died in that attack are always the focus, those who died afterwards certainly should be counted as the death toll in those bombings as well. And the same in Yemen, where you have Saudi Arabia pretty much indiscriminately bombing the civilian population there. And with most of Yemen's medical centers not being operational, you have a situation there where lots of people are going to be dying every time a hospital gets bombed just because there's no other medical care in the area. So now we could talk about some news with Iran. A few weeks ago, Iran tested a medium-range ballistic missile, and this provoked the U.S. to make some pretty strong statements. This is back when Flynn was National Security Advisor and put Iran on notice. Trump came out with some pretty nasty tweets and saying that Iran's not going to, get away with things anymore, kind of implying that the easy days Iran had under Obama are over. I don't necessarily agree with this, but this is the narrative coming out of the Trump campaign. So in response to this ballistic missile test, we have Senator Lindsey Graham suggesting that the U.S. should put more sanctions on Iran. This seems to have bipartisan support, as even Senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, he's a Democrat and a strong supporter of the Iran nuclear deal, said that the U.S. needs to clearly pit sides between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I think strongly suggesting that the U.S. should pick Saudi Arabia as a side, and saying that it was more than within the bounds of the Iran nuclear deal for the U.S. to put more sanctions on Iran, although one of the reasons Iran signed the nuclear deal was to receive less sanctions from the U.S. Putting these sanctions on Iran is going to create a problem because it's going to create a disincentive for Iran to comply with the nuclear deal. While I don't think that Iran's working towards a nuclear bomb, and certainly hasn't been since 2003. Iran has made a lot of limitations to its civilian nuclear program in order to make 100% sure that there's no way the Iranians could ever get a nuclear bomb. And if the U.S. keeps piling sanctions onto Iran, they may see no reason to continue to follow through with complying with the rules and regulations set on them through the Iranian nuclear deal. So we could see a situation where things could continue to escalate in Iran, because if Iran doesn't see a reason to follow the deal, because the U.S. keeps putting more and more sanctions on them, so they're not getting any of the economic benefits of the deal, the U.S. is really going to use that to say, oh, look, Iran's working towards a bomb now, let's go to war. It's been a Republican line for a long time that we have to stop Iran. I don't know how many of you remember John McCain's little bomb, bomb, bomb Iran song, but it is quite a disturbing image that some of the more hawkish Republicans have towards Iran. Hopefully cooler heads in the Senate can prevail and prevent these sanctions from going in place, but if they do, they're going to really hamper the Iran nuclear deal. They're going to make it so Iran doesn't have as many motivations to follow the deal, and they're only going to lead to more conflict between the two countries. Another country the U.S. seems destined to have a conflict with is Russia. New sanctions may be put in place on Russia by the Senate. Lindsey Graham came out and said that 2017 will be a year of kicking Russia in the ass. Lindsey Graham, with his recent statements on Iran and Russia, really seems to be hawkish and not wanting peace at all. This statement from Graham and his idea to put new sanctions on Russia comes as 1,000 U.S. troops that are stationed in Poland are being moved to a town 85 miles from the Russian border. So we're going to continue to hear the hawkish senators in the American media talk about Russian aggression and really not define what that is, while the U.S. is moving troops on the Russian border. I may have told you this already, but I remember during Hillary Clinton's campaign, at one point, she was talking about how Russia was positioning their troops really close to NATO troops. Well, it turns out that Russia was positioning their troops within Russia, and it was the NATO troops that were near the Russian border that they were positioning them across from. And she was talking about how this was an example of Russian aggression. This seems completely ridiculous for a country not to be able to put their troops where they want inside their own country, and for the U.S. to complain about Russian aggression when the U.S.'s troops are the ones that are on the other side of the world and the Russian troops are within their own borders. I'd like to use this opportunity of Russian-Iranian sanctions to just talk about sanctions in general. I think one of the things that got lost under Obama was people stopped talking about if sanctions are effective and what the status of sanctions are. It has become the narrative that if you are not in favor of sanctions against Iran or Russia, that means you're in favor of Putin or the Ayatollah of Iran, and that you support a state that you don't want sanctions against. This is really untrue and ridiculous. I think we should have seen from the Cuban embargo, one very prevalent point is that sanctions obviously don't work because Castro's still in charge there, and we had sanctions on the country for I think over 50 years. So what does putting additional sanctions on Iran or Russia do? Well, nothing really, other than hurt the civilian population of Russia and Iran. I think we all know that Iran and Russia have enough natural resources that the elites of the country are never going to go hungry or starve or have any problems. Putin certainly isn't gonna be the one that feels the effects of the sanctions, and it's not gonna turn the people of the country against the leaders of the country. It's gonna turn them against the U.S. The U.S. is the one that's putting the sanctions on the country and then not allowing the economy to prosper like it should. It's not Putin that's doing that, and I think that's what the Russian Iranian people will see. If you imagine that other countries were putting sanctions on the U.S., I don't think U.S. citizens would say, oh, well, it's Obama's fault, or, oh, well, it's Trump's fault that these sanctions are put on us. They're going to condemn the country that's putting sanctions on us and probably see it as like an act of war and want to go war with these countries for doing so. The other thing I want to talk about with sanctions is that I think sanctions are an act of war. Now, a lot of people see sanctions just as, oh, well, this is a minor way to show that we disapprove of what your country's doing or the actions of your country. But really what it's doing is it's preventing the country's economy from getting the goods it needs and really hurting the civilians of the country. In a lot of ways, it's almost like having a blockade of the country, not allowing goods to travel in and out of the country. Also, a lot of times when sanctions are applied to a country, all the foreign assets for that country are confiscated, and so sometimes you'll have the U.S. holding on to billions of dollars of a country that country is no longer allowed to have access to. And there are other issues as well. If, let's say, an Iranian student is studying abroad and that student's parents live in Iran still, those parents are unable to transfer money to their child, and so if their child really needs medical care or just needs to eat. I remember when I was in college, my parents would send me money quite often. Their parents aren't able to do that, and it really creates a lot of barriers for the average Iranian citizen from being able to do business and transact and send money abroad and do lots of other things that Americans consider just normal everyday actions. And putting those barriers in place really reminds those citizens every day that the U.S. is the enemy. And while it may not seem like an act of war in the sense that there's planes dropping bombs on Iran, I think it feels in a lot of the same ways to the civilians that it's the same thing. We could also look at it as a way that provokes a lot of wars as well. If we look at what happened under Bill Clinton, the U.S. had sanctions in place on Iraq and destroyed a lot of Iraqi infrastructure. Those sanctions led to the death of 500,000 Iraqi children, and then this was used by Osama bin Laden to radicalize the 9/11 hijackers and used by him to justify the acts on 9/11 that ultimately led to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, it's a situation where if the sanctions weren't in place, maybe we wouldn't have all these wars now. And looking back on the chain of events that led to 9/11 and led to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which ultimately led to the rise of ISIS and the situation in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya today. If the U.S. didn't put those sanctions in place and if those Iraqi children didn't die, what would the world be like today? Maybe a lot more peaceful. Maybe a lot better. This is something that was always echoed by Ron Paul when he was a congressman, that putting sanctions on country was really an act of war, and that the Congress should pass a declaration of war before putting sanctions on countries, and not just use sanctions as a way to signal to your base that you're a hawk and that you disapprove of the regime of a certain country. Like I said, I think now that we have a lot of confusion where anytime somebody isn't in favor of putting sanctions on a country, then it's used against them to say, oh, you support this regime then. And so just because I don't want sanctions on North Korea doesn't mean I support Kim Jong-un. I just don't think sanctions will ever accomplish the goal that they say they're trying to accomplish. In fact, sometimes they work against that end goal because, like I said, the leaders of the country will use the sanctions as an excuse in a way to drum up hatred for America and kind of unite the population in a nationalist way. And also having the sanctions against the country prevents trade between the two countries. And in a oppressive regime like the North Korean regime, having less sanctions and having more commerce between the two countries could expose the North Koreans to how great Western culture is and how great it is to live in the West and how crappy it is to live in North Korea. And that could really lead the people to demanding some change. However, that's never going to happen if the North Koreans are completely isolated from the Americans, and all they hear about from the leaders about America is how the U.S. sanctions are keeping them from being able to eat. So for the last topic today, I'd like to talk about Trump's policy in Yemen. So far, after 4.5 weeks of Trump in Yemen, we've seen a continuation pretty much of the Obama policy, maybe a little bit more aggressiveness out of Trump. A few things that Trump has done was the raid in Yemen, which was a botched raid, completely went the wrong way, killed a bunch of children, didn't kill any of the Al-Qaeda leaders. In fact, the most senior person killed was a tribal leader loyal to the government that the U.S. is supporting in Yemen. And then we have also seen Trump send the USS Cole to be off the coast of Yemen. One interesting part of the history of the USS Cole is it was actually attacked by Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And this may be a nuance lost on Trump, but there's certainly a lot of memory surrounding the USS Cole in Yemen, and so it could maybe provoke an attack and be used by the Al-Qaeda and ISIS people in Yemen to really drum up anti-American support by saying, look, the oppressive USS Cole is back. Another thing Trump is looking at doing is selling more weapons to Saudi Arabia. Obama, over the course of his presidency, sold hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons to Saudi Arabia. But towards the end of his presidency, the Saudis bombed a Yemeni funeral, killing hundreds of people, where a funeral was being held. I've heard reports that thousands of people were inside, and Saudi Arabia hit the building with all these people inside at least 4 times, killing hundreds of innocent people. And so after that, Obama was reviewing the policy he had with Saudi Arabia, and then at the end of that decided not to send some laser-guided ammunition to Saudi Arabia. It really wasn't much of a stance against Saudi Arabia, but at least it was something. And now we have Trump saying that he wants to reverse that policy and go ahead and improve those weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. So Trump's policy in Yemen seems to be a continuation of the Obama policy with maybe some escalation. In Yemen, we have Saudi Arabia just indiscriminately bombing civilians with U.S.-made bombs and U.S.-made planes being refueled by U.S. mid-air refueling planes. Having an embargo of Yemen with Saudi and U.S. ships is really speaking volumes to the Yemeni people that the U.S. is an enemy of theirs, and the U.S. being an enemy of the people of Yemen is not a good thing, because we don't need more anti-Americanism in the Middle East. So with that, not a whole lot of good news today, but a lot of foreign policy news. I'll wrap up the show. So once again, for anybody who wants to check out the show, check out all my other work, I suggest you go to kylesfilesblog.com, files spelled F-Y-L-E-S, or going on Facebook and checking me out at facebook.com/kylesfiles. You can follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE. You can check out the podcast page at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And I'm a blogger at thelibertarianinstitute.org, so check that out as well. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you Wednesday.